Okay, as we continue studying Better Together, we'll be looking at chapters 7, 8, and 9, tonight. The first one deals with the financial and legal aspects of a merger. Some church mergers can get really complicated. In most cases, when two churches merge, both own property. Sometimes one of the churches or both of the churches have debts. Sometimes they have property that is not a part of the church building, but a house or sometimes even a business that has been given to the church. All that stuff has to be dealt with. It can get really complicated and can sometimes delay the process by many months. We are very fortunate in the merger that we're proposing with Gospel Community because they own no property and neither congregation has any debt. So that's two big simplifying things. But there are other legal issues. There are the issues related to incorporation. Rivermont Avenue Baptist Church is incorporated, so is Gospel Community. Our incorporation will be ended as we merge and come under their incorporation. There are other legal issues that come up. For instance, restricted gifts. Just this week, we have been talking in the Finance Committee and in the work group about the Blankenship Scholarship that Rivermont Avenue Baptist Church has been able to offer for quite some number of years. That would come under the umbrella of a restricted gift. This is money that we can't spend as a congregation, even though it's in our possession, except under the terms of that scholarship. Well, there is a complicating factor here. Gospel Community Church does not accept restricted gifts. That's been their policy from the beginning. And so Ron Rash has been in contact with the surviving members of the Blankenship family, advising them about this, and what looks likely at this point, it hasn't been finally settled, is that the remaining funds in the scholarship will be given out this year and the account will be closed. There's not a lot of money left in there anyway, a little over $5,000, but it's just one of those things that has to be attended to in this process. We have another restricted, actually when I first came here a little over 6 years ago, we had quite a few restricted line items, but Ron Neblett in particular went to war on those things. He didn't like them. And as he was Finance Committee Chair, he was whittling them down at every opportunity. The only other one we've got right now is a line item designated for the connecting point. And we've got some rather expensive heating and air conditioning issues over there, and those will be paid from that special account. So it's the kind that's, it's really complicated. You can't really do this without at least a little bit of paid legal advice. There's just too many things that you want to make sure you get correct legally. And again, we're very fortunate. It's not nearly as complicated as it often is for us. But there is one additional complicating factor here, and that is the status of the Early Learning Center. Now, some of you have been involved in conversations, I have heard them for the 6+ years I've been here, where folks have said repeatedly, we really need some kind of legal firewall between the Early Learning Center and the church. We live in an age in which law schools offer classes on how to sue churches. That literally is true. Churches used to be sort of untouchable. People hesitated to take a church to court. Well, they look for opportunities now. We are just another target. And that's the unfortunate reality of the world in which we live. The Early Learning Center, if you think about where our greatest liability risk is, it's not the people coming to worship on Sunday morning, it's the people dropping their kids off downstairs. And there's any number of ways that a lawsuit could get generated. So, what has been suggested in the past, the Early Learning Center needs to get its own 501c3 incorporation status. We have learned, thanks to Ron's hard work, that there is another option, a limited corporation that is a subset of the parent corporation. It is a less expensive and faster way to create that firewall. It protects the congregation from ascending liability, but it maintains a greater level of control in the process. So, this is stuff that, frankly, they don't tell you in seminary. So I have had very little to do with the process of working through this, but we've got people who know a lot more about it than I ever will, who are working with us, and in part thanks to Ron's connections with the Baptist Foundation in Richmond. He has access to some top flight legal advice, and he is making the best of it. Sometimes churches, as they approach a merger, and inevitably, nobody ever knows for sure what this is going to look like. Any more than when you got married. You didn't know for sure what you were getting into. I guarantee you, what you got was not what you expected. Maybe it was better, maybe it was worse, maybe it was just different. But when Joyce and I got married, we were teenagers. And I guarantee you, we had no way of predicting what our life was going to be like a couple years down the road, much less 40 plus. It's the same thing with mergers. Until you're in it, you're not going to know what it's going to be like. Now, some folks realize that, and they say, well, maybe we need an escape clause. Maybe we need a way out. I guess that's kind of like writing in a prenuptial agreement into a marriage contract. It's not terribly romantic. It doesn't speak a lot about trust and confidence. In Better Together, they address this and they say they strongly recommend against it. Their advice rather is take the time to build the trust you need and do it right the first time. Don't get into the incredibly messy and contentious business of getting into a merger and then trying to wiggle your way out of it. It almost always ends badly when you try. So that's sort of a quick summary of the legal stuff. If you've got specific questions about it, I would recommend you talk to Ron. He's way more deeply involved in this than I ever will be. Talk about the theological issues, I'll talk with you all night. Legal issues, I'm quickly in over my head. The next chapter in the book addresses the whole issue of personnel changes. The number one question that comes up in mergers, particularly from the perspective of the joining church, which is what we are. Gospel Community is the lead church. We are joining into their structure, not the other way around. And so members of the joining church, the big question is what's going to happen to our staff? And as we have compiled the question cards that have come in from you, by far and away, that is the biggest question that has been raised by the members of Rimroud Avenue. And of the staff, again, in Better Together, it says, the question that is most frequently asked is, what about the senior pastor? Now, in about 30% of mergers, the joining church doesn't have a pastor, so that problem, never arises. Where they do have a pastor, the likely scenarios, as the book spells it out, are these. The first one is the two senior pastors of the merging churches become co-pastors. This rarely occurs for the simple reason that it almost never works. And my 40 plus years in the ministry, and I think back on my time on convention staffs and association staffs, I have yet to hear of a co-pastorate that worked and worked well. It just doesn't work. Maybe in an ideal universe it would, but we don't live in that universe. And I said from the very beginning that I would not be a part of a co-pastorate. That's just simply not an option for me. The next thing, the thing that happens in 90% of mergers where there are two pastors, is the pastor of the joining church becomes a staff member of the lead church. So that's what happens 9 times out of 10. And that is certainly an option that I have had in these discussions. The other thing that happens in about 10% of the cases, the pastor of the joining church departs after the merger. This is something that has the potential of being a real problem for this simple fact. If it is not handled very carefully, very wisely, very sensitively, it can cause conflict within the membership of the joining church. If the members of Rivermont Avenue Baptist Church were to learn that I'm going to be leaving, and if they sense in any way that this is something that's being forced upon me, well, some of you have been quite emphatic in private conversations with me, that's something that's just unacceptable to you. So whatever happens, it has to be handled very carefully, and it has to be something that all parties involved are on the same page with. The authors of Better Together state, in these situations, it's wise to offer a generous severance package, a happy farewell. If the pastor of the joining church is leaving, it needs to be on the best possible terms, just to minimize the risk of a problem. With regard to the rest of the staff of the joining church, similar issues arise. I will let you know right now, the representatives of Gospel Community and the work group are having individual conversations by appointment with the various members of our staff, and in part to let the Gospel Community elders get a better sense of who our staff are, what they do, what their experience is, and to talk about what their desires are going forward. One of the things the book warns about is avoiding sweeping promises to the staff. Don't make promises you can't keep. And sometimes, and if there's any way to make this even more painful than it might be, it is to promise something that you can't carry out on. To say, everybody's going to have their job, it's going to be at the same salary level, you're going to be having the same kind of responsibilities, and then at the last minute you discover, actually some of you we're not going to be able to keep, or we're going to have to cut your pay. Don't promise something that you cannot keep. Second point they make, retain any staff that are genuinely needed and can be afforded. Now, obviously, when you combine two churches and two church staffs, there is a very high probability of some redundancy. Now, redundancies can be handled in a couple different ways. One, you simply eliminate positions in people. Two, you repurpose people. You give them a task that's different from what they were doing. The focus shifts. Of course, that's where you have to really find out, where does this staff person want to be? It's all well and good to say, we can keep you on, but your job description is going to look quite a bit different. Are you good with that? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is, thanks for the offer, but I'll put an application in at Walmart. This really doesn't look like what I want to do. Again, the recommendation is offer generous severance packages, particularly keeping in mind the years of service. Most of our staff have been here a long time. And then the final word of advice, be gentle, affirming, and clear. This whole process is stressful for everybody, folks. You're feeling it. The staff's feeling it. Some of you may have gone through a merger in the corporate world or something and know firsthand what it's like to not know if you're going to have a job tomorrow, or what it's going to look like, or who your new boss is going to be. I mean, there's a lot of issues here. This whole process is complicated. That's why it's so hard for it to work. That's why mergers so often fall apart before they even get to the merger point. There's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of issues. There's a lot of details. Some of you have had to plan a big wedding for a daughter. Usually the bride's family gets the brunt of it. And you may be thrilled with the wedding. You may be thrilled with your new son-in-law. But when you're in the thick of all those details, trying to put that all together, there are points at which you just want to leave town. It's just so stressful. Or some of you have built a house. And I'm not talking about, one of these paint-by-number construction deals. I mean, where you go in there and you've got to make every single decision. And it may be your dream house, but the actual process of getting it done can be absolutely mind-numbing. This is the kind of process we're going through here, folks. We've got a lot of details in a lot of different areas. And many of them impinge on turf that somebody believes is their turf. And all of a sudden, they're not in charge anymore. This is not strictly personnel, but it's a related issue that the book brings up, and that is lay leadership. Just about everybody in this room is on at least one committee, and several of you are on several. Some of those are committee roles that you just grudgingly agreed to because they needed to fill it and you felt sorry for the person who asked. Some of them, though, are things about which you have been very passionate for a very long time. It's something you really care about. And now, with this new structure, this transition, all these new people, what's going to happen? Some of that is going to happen very rapidly. There's just going to be some very different ways of doing things. Some of it's going to take time. And one of the things that our work group, in connection with the elders and staff at Gospel Community, have agreed is that we're going to need, for at least a period of some months and maybe for a couple years, some kind of a transition team that is heavily represented by Rivermont Avenue Baptist Church people. In part, this is because initially we're not going to, none of our people are going to be on the elders. And that's not because they don't want us on the elders, it's because they've got a really rigorous process of selecting and vetting and approving new elders. And they're not going to just stick somebody on there because we want them on there with, and short circuit that process. But in the meantime, everybody recognizes it's important that the portion of the Gospel Community Church of Rivermont that is made up of RABC people, going to want to feel like they've got representation, they've got a voice in what is happening. And so some form of a transition team is going to come together. And how that all happens is still in discussion. But it'll happen very quickly. And it will continue as long as everybody feels it's needed. There are a couple areas in particular where that's going to be real important very quickly. One has to do with the finances, and the other has to do with the building and grounds operations at this location. Because the gospel community people, the first ones say, we haven't got a clue what it's going to take to manage this property. And we've been at it long enough to know what the issues are and where the problems are. The final chapter we're looking at tonight deals with things to consider when determining whether or not to merge. And the first thing they say is you begin with a vision. Vision is the starting point of a successful merger. A vision of the future that looks different from the past that has become so painful. And so you then enter into that conversation. And of course, we've been in that conversation now for a long time. And one of the things that profoundly struck the members of the work group was the very way in which that conversation started. The highly unlikely conversation of Scott Podolsek and Brian Freeberg on an airplane getting ready to land. I've never been a big fan of the phrase "it's a God thing," but a very biblical way of putting it, I believe that is providential. I believe that is the providence of God at work. In fact, one of the things, skipping down a little bit, that the book says is do a God check. Do you see God's hand in this process? I'll talk more about that in a minute, but right up front, it sort of sent shivers down our spine as we in the work group talked about how this came together. You have to define the relationship that you're talking about. No two mergers are alike. I've talked about the fact that in our merger, some of the legal things are a lot less complicated than they can be. And the things that the book says about mergers in generality may or may not apply to any specific circumstance. When they talk about the result of their survey of many churches that have gone through mergers, so you're getting an average. You're getting, this is what has happened in most cases. For instance, in most mergers, taking that broad cross-section, within the first year of the merger, either during the process or after it, the two merging churches lose about 20% of their original members. That's the statistical average. We talked about that at some length last night in the Finance Committee. And Ron, in chairing that committee, said, in the case of Rivermont Avenue Baptist Church, he believes we've already lost most of that 20%. And I think he's right. And as we talked about it in the committee, I think everybody had the consensus. There may be a few more people who will go through the merger and decide this is really not for them and move on. But at this point, we don't think that's a big number. And conversely, we know about some folks who are already talking about coming back. So most of that loss on our end, we think, has already happened. On the other end of the spectrum, gospel community, again, when you talk about the average merger, you're talking about a church that is, changing, giving up property and other things. Because Gospel Community is such a new church, and they have lived in kind of a fluid state from their beginning, there's good reason to believe that they're not going to lose 20% either. And the ones, in my own opinion, if there's any of them that's likely to leave, it would be among the college students who might think it's just kind of cool to have church in a nightclub. And as Nate will tell you, the students that they've got coming represent almost none of their giving strength. So in terms of Ron's comment last night in the Finance Committee was, if the worst case scenario happens and both churches lose 20% of their current membership or attenders, financially it's going to work. They've already run the numbers in the as they have put together a spreadsheet of the combined funds. So financially, this thing is going to be sound. You build on common DNA. What do you have in common? Is this a good match? Now, at first glance, you look at this and how can this be a good match? We got one church where the average age is well north of 50, and another church where you can count on one hand the people over 40. So in terms of age, we don't have a lot in common. The people on the staff that I'm going to be working with are, without exception, younger than my children. So in that respect, that doesn't look like it makes any sense. A church full of millennials and a church full of people that are at or near or beyond retirement age. But what a number of us, as we've gotten to know the team at Gospel Community, the thing that's run through a lot of our minds is, these people remind us of us 20, 30 years ago. What they're passionate about, what they're, the thing that excites them is the very thing that, I look at what they're doing. I think that's why I went in the ministry in the first place. So when you talk about their belief system, their mission, their vision, their desire to do things well, there's a great deal we have in common. And the more we've gotten to know them, the more we found in common. The authors continue, you need to integrate your unique strengths. And here's where this merger really starts to make all kinds of sense. Because each congregation has strengths that in most cases represent a weakness on the other team. They're meeting in a nightclub. We have a magnificent facility. We're crying for kids. We don't have enough children in our Sunday school classes to have a decent, what's the word I'm looking for? The group dynamics stink when you got a class with 2 kids in it. You look at Joyce, as she prepares lessons for those preschoolers, and she reads the recommended activities, and said, well, this would be great if I had 10 kids, but some weeks I don't have any, and never do I have more than 2 or 3. All of a sudden, that's no longer a problem. And the energy that, I've long admired my father's ability to go out there and cut 10 cords of firewood into his 80s. When I visited him the other day, I think his firewood cutting days are probably over. But, no matter how energetic you are with each passing year, the reserve that you're working with is depleted. And there's a lot of stuff that we would do as a church if we just could get some younger people to help carry the load. And now that's coming. On their end of the picture, they're crying for mentors. They've got young mothers who are, trying to deal with the issues of raising kids, and they'd like to have the wisdom of somebody who's been there and done that. And all of a sudden, they're going to have a lot of wisdom to draw on. The sense that we've had is it's like a puzzle with two pieces, and it just fits really nicely. One of the most mergers, it said identify the differences. Most mergers underestimate the difficulties in navigating the small degree of differences, especially cultural ones. What are the differences that could derail this merger? You've all heard the saying, don't sweat the small stuff. That doesn't apply in church mergers. You've got to sweat the small stuff. It's the small stuff that usually blows up in your face. All right. Those of you who are married or have been married, think about the kind of discussions that you had to have that very first autumn and winter. What kind of stuffing do you want in the turkey? Usually, it's amazing how passionate people can get about stuffing. Do you have the jelly cranberry sauce, or the cranberry sauce has got the whole berries in it? People get real passionate about that kind of stuff. Do you have turkey at Christmas, or do you have ham, or do you have both? Do you open the presents on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning? People get real these are little things. This is not the kind of stuff that you talk about in premarital counseling. But it can become a real big issue. It's that same principle at work as we work through a lot of little things that are insignificant in themselves, except that they're really important to somebody. And if that somebody happens to be someone who's not real flexible, it can become a point of contention. In marriage, the best example of two people that managed to work through amazing differences was a couple I knew when I pastored a church in the Sierras when I was a seminary student years ago. John and Betty Siteman. These two people were about as different as two human beings can be. John was born and raised in Rhode Island. Betty was raised in Bakersfield, California. John was a lifelong Democrat. Betty was a lifelong Republican. John was a lifelong Roman Catholic. Betty was a lifelong Southern Baptist. That's just the big issues. Now, I think one of the ways that they managed to make it work in the early years, John was an enlisted man in the Navy. He retired as a chief petty officer, I think. And so for a long time he was at sea, and that sort of gave them some breathing room. But incredibly, when I got to know them, they had a wonderful marriage and a wonderful relationship in spite of all those differences. Now, the flip side, one day Betty said, she would not recommend this to anybody else. She said the price we had to pay to get there was just too great. But when Betty was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 60, she prepared her husband for life without her. I even taught him how to bake bread. It was amazing watching. So you got to deal with all those differences. You got to deal with the financial realities. Now, I've already talked about that. We're in good shape on that score. You have to assess all the relationships. This is even more complicated than you first realize, because you've got three different sets of relationships you're talking about. You got the relationships within Rivermont Avenue Baptist Church. You got the relationships within Gospel Community Church. And then you've got the relationships between members of those two different congregations. And all those relationships are going to be subject to shifting. Most people, when they come to church, in order for it to feel like it was a Sunday, they've got an unwritten list of people that they need to make contact with. The people you want to say hi to, the people you want to reconnect with. You might only see them on Sunday, but it really hasn't been church unless you see those people. For some people, it's a very short list. For some people, it's a much longer one. What happens when you find yourself coming to one of two worship services, and probably very quickly one of three, and the halls are so crowded that it's hard to make contact with anybody, and the sanctuary is packed, and you're parking 5 or 6 blocks away? Are you going to be able to make those contacts? And what's more, is your list of necessary contacts going to change, and is that going to cause some of your present relationships to be strained? The closest thing I ever experienced to this was about 3 weeks into the 4th grade. The school district boundary between the district I was in and another one shifted. And all of a sudden they brought in a bunch of kids from the other district, and they changed the room. In our classroom, suddenly a bunch of the people ended up in another room, and strangers that we hadn't gone to school with for the previous 3 years were in our class with us. It was a real big adjustment. In my case, it worked out great, because that was when my lifelong friendship with Bob Yarbrough, the seminary professor, really began, because he was part of that group that came in from the other school. I'd known him very slightly in Sunday school before that, and I took him kind of under my wing to show him the ropes in the new school, and we were off and running. So you may find that 6 months after the merger, you've got a new best friend. But how's it going to how are your present friends going to relate to that? There may be some jealousy there that is never expressed, but it's felt. It's all going to be moving. And it's going to take a while for it to find its own level. Establish a timeline. We're very much into that already. We got the vote in just a couple weeks. During the summer, things are going to be happening like crazy. Sometime toward August, probably, best guess, there's going to be sort of a couple preview attempts to do a combined service before all the college kids get back, and we get into things real seriously in September. Do a God check. Is there a profound sense that God is in this? Don't move forward with the merger unless you can see God's fingerprints all over it. Now, I'm sure everybody in this room is at a different point on assessing that. But I can tell you, I can speak for the expanded work group without any hesitation. Every one of us see God's fingerprints all over this. And the elders and staff at Gospel Community are saying exactly the same thing. Then you have to take a vote. A Gospel Community doesn't because they're elder-led, but they certainly have had to bring their congregation along with them. Our vote will be on June the 4th at the beginning of the worship service. If you're in the habit of coming in late, you may miss it, because it will be the very first thing we do. It will be by ballot, secret ballot. And the ballots will be taken up, and I'm going to ask the deacons to be responsible for selecting 2 or 3 deacons to count them. And then the result will be announced at the end of the service. Assuming that vote is positive, according to the Constitution, legally we can do this with a simple majority. Nobody thinks that it's a good idea for a church to proceed in a merger with a 51% vote. So, in what I think is a very unlikely event that it is a close vote, at that point, as the moderator, excuse me, I would entertain a motion to reconsider. And frankly, the people on the work group, if this isn't a very strong majority, they're not going to feel comfortable going forward either. And there has been some question about absentee ballots. I can find nothing in our Constitution and bylaws to allow that as an option. And we want to make absolutely certain that we do this following the letter of the law of our Constitution. So, that's better together in those 3 chapters. Now, we've got about 15, 16 minutes. And it has been suggested, and I think it's a great idea, that we take advantage of that time to spend some time in prayer about this. We will do the same next week when we finish this book study. And the following Wednesday, the Wednesday before the vote, we will spend the whole hour in prayer leading up to that vote on June the 4th.